For nearly 30 years, Hill Pittman has been blamed, vilified, and turned into a scapegoat for Everest's infamous 1996 disaster, where a deadly storm claimed the lives of 8 climbers. The rumors spread like wildfire. The diva climber, the wealthy New York socialite, more concerned with her coffee than her companions, the snobby rich woman who didn't even thank her rescuers. Some people have gone so far as to say that she was the cause of the entire tragedy. But what if I told you that most of what you've heard about her is completely wrong? Today we're deep diving into these stories, exposing the lies and revealing the truth that you've never heard before. Oh, it's been out there, but it's been ignored for nearly 3 decades, and we're going to look at why. Okay, so before I get into the video, let's clear up a few rumors about me. No, I'm not being paid by Sandy Hill or anyone she knows to make these videos. And I'm not related to her either. I live in the woods in northern Canada and barely see people most days, so the idea of me being buddies with a 69-year-old woman in California is actually pretty funny. And if you've followed my channel for a while, you know that I love telling stories about adventurous people, mountaineering, and deep diving into all these stories. And that's what drew me to the Sandy Hill story in the first place. Like many others, I believe some of those long-standing rumors about her. But when I started digging, it didn't take long to see how far from the truth those stories really were. What really got me was how these rumors have been twisted and spread for decades, so much that I made my first video on her months ago. After that, a few other creators jumped on the Sandy Hill bandwagon, but instead of taking the time to look at the facts, most of them just recycled the old, tired rumors. And most of these rumors came from specific publications where you can tell right off the bat that they had it out for Sandy. They were pretty much hatchet job articles. And they've been taken as complete truth, without anybody questioning them. Sandy became the perfect scapegoat, vilified in the media and the public eye for things that weren't even true. Over time, the lies kept piling up, twisting the story of what really happened. But I'm today going to give you proof, real evidence that most others won't. We all want someone to blame for the 1996 Everest disaster because it was tragic and so many people lost their lives. But the truth is, there wasn't anyone to blame. Sandy just happened to be the one who got singled out. And while the world spun these grand stories about her, she stayed mostly quiet as it all unfolded. So let's start at the beginning of where these rumors about Sandy Hill really began. Jon Krakauer's Outside article and his book Into Thin Air. Krakauer dedicates 5 pages to Sandy, focusing heavily on her wealth, social status, marriage, apartment, magazine covers, friends who had planes, and her expensive campaign to become the first American woman to climb the 7 summits. And climbing the 7 summits at that time in the 90s, it was actually a pretty big deal, because not a lot of people had done it. But Krakauer's fixation on her wealth is just undeniable. He quotes Beck Weathers as saying, "When Sandy goes to climb a mountain, she doesn't do it exactly like you and me," highlighting her bringing comforts like good food and drinks, as though it made her a less serious climber. There's even the odd mention of her wearing climbing gear over a dress at a going-away party. It seems like a small, irrelevant detail, but it's not accidental. By including this image, Krakauer reinforces the idea of Sandy being out of place and not taking the expedition seriously. The picture of this wealthy socialite combining her dress with climbing gear paints her as a contradiction, someone who's wealthy, fashionable, yet trying to enter the serious world of mountaineering. This comment also plays into the sexist and classist stereotypes, suggesting that she was more concerned with her appearance than actual climbing. And you may be asking, did Jon Krakauer talk about what other people wore? Well, no, he didn't. But he chooses to include this little detail about Sandy because it supports the narrative he was starting to build about her. And the focus on wealth is just relentless and kind of weird. There were many other climbers on Everest that were wealthy, including doctors and lawyers, and they all paid $60,000+ to climb. In another part, he writes about how a Sherpa would often roll up Sandy's sleeping bag and pack her rucksack for her. But he conveniently leaves out that Sherpas do everything for everyone. Sherpas carry all the heavy gear, the tents, stoves, food, drinks, oxygen, everything needed to stay on the mountain for months at a time. getting waited on wasn't unique to Sandy, it was pretty much the standard practice on Everest. Krakauer's description of what he carried in on the trek was nothing more than a day hiker's pack, and it makes this critique of Sandy even more absurd. He even admits in a dispatch to Outside on April 15, 1996, to being pampered with tea in his bed every morning, showing that it wasn't just Sandy who received this level of service. This selective judgment conveniently ignores the fact that none of the clients, including Krakauer, were burdened with real work on the mountain. Despite claiming not to blame her, Krakauer dedicates more attention to Sandy than any other climber in his book. Doug Hansen was a climber that he says he got the closest to, and he got about 2 pages. Beck Weathers, one of the more significant figures in this story, got 1 page, and the rest of his teammates got about a paragraph altogether. Krakauer also quotes Jane Bromett, Scott Fischer's publicist and climbing partner, as saying, "Sandy could be exhausting to be around because she needed to be the center of attention and was always yapping away about herself." What Krakauer neglects to mention is that he and Jane were longtime friends, which raises the question about the objectivity of her criticism. In fact, Jane later admitted to the co-author of The Climb that Jon is a friend and I don't want to embarrass him, after she revealed some inconsistencies in his book. In the Daily Telegraph on September 22, 1997, Krakauer was quoted as saying about Sandy that in some ways she represents what has gone wrong with modern mountain climbing. He's reinforcing that narrative that the commercialization of Everest is all her fault, but not the fault of any of the other hundreds of climbers that were on Everest that year, including himself. While Krakauer later claimed that he didn't directly blame Sandy for the disaster, these quotes tell a different story. By singling her out as a symbol of everything wrong with the sport, he indirectly placed the weight of the tragedy on her. And this narrative stuck, setting the stage for media vilification. Krakauer's portrayal of Sandy in Into Thin Air didn't just affect how readers viewed her, it set the stage for the media to completely skew public perception. Reviews of his book, like the one from the Edmonton Journal, described the climbers as a cast of characters right out of Pulp Fiction. But who got singled out? Sandy Hill Pittman. But it doesn't stop there. The article goes on to say that Sandy cowered behind a rock with a guide and several other climbers while the storm ripped through Everest. The real kicker is that there were 8 other people there with her, all doing the exact same thing, trying to survive. Yet, Sandy's the only one singled out, as if she alone was too weak to face the storm. This selective storytelling turns Sandy into a lightning rod for criticism. And then there's the Vanity Fair article, which was a brutal takedown of Sandy. From the start, it's easy to see it was clearly a targeted attack on her. And I'm not the only one who thought so. The Oregonian even noted that Vanity Fair broke away from its usual kissy-poo treatment of the rich and powerful to savage dilettante social climber Sandy Hill Pittman. Describing the profile is designed to humiliate her, portraying her as a wealthy woman out of her element. Newsday echoed this sentiment, calling it a withering profile meant to mortify and humiliate her. The Knoxville News-Sentinel summarized the Vanity Fair article by saying the author has a grand old time wagging a disapproving finger at Sandy Pittman. Isn't it delightful for earthbound plebes like you and me to feel superior to someone with so much money and so little conscience? Such is the underlying message. And the Vanity Fair article focused more on trivial details like the brand of underwear she wore under her Gore-Tex than the facts of what actually happened on the mountain. Many sources in the article were vague or anonymous, raising more questions about the article's credibility. And it makes me wonder if there's a personal vendetta between the Vanity Fair author and Sandy, given that they both moved in those same upper-class New York social circles. No matter what, Krakauer provides the blueprint for how Sandy would be treated in the media. And it's almost comical how the perception of Sandy sharply contrasted with that of Krakauer. He's seen as the gritty journalist, a man of action who survived the disaster and lived to tell the tale. In fact, an article from 1997 when the TV movie came out, it portrayed him falsely as a hero who led a rescue back up the mountain, a claim that is completely untrue. Meanwhile, Sandy was blamed for her personality. One article even said that Sandy Hill Pittman's arrogance may have caused this foolishly unnecessary loss of lives. Krakauer chose to set Sandy up as a convenient scapegoat rather than focus on the real story of the expedition, the complex decisions made by guides and climbers, the lack of communication among teams, and the dangerous effects of summit fever. Author, filmmaker, and screenwriter Jennifer Jordan talked about Sandy in her talk Women of K2, and she refers to the 1996 Everest tragedy.
Earlier, I said my fascination with the big mountains and women's place on them started with the Everest tragedy, but it was fed by reading Into Thin Air and trying to imagine what life was like in that death zone, that magic mark around 25,000 feet where life slowly suffocates to death. As I read the book, I wondered why one climber, one woman, Sandy Hill Pittman of New York City, was singled out for shame and blame in the tragedy. And it seemed to me that she was vilified for who she was rather than what she did. She was, after all, a client, not a guide. She was taking orders, not giving them. And when I interviewed many of the other survivors of that deadly storm, I heard a very different story. I was told that Sandy Hill was strong and experienced climber. David Brashears called her fearless, and if any of you know David or know of him, you know that's high praise indeed. In fact, Sandy had every right to be on the mountain that day. Yes, she had a bad summit day and collapsed. But you know what? She wasn't alone. 8 people died, and many of them the world's best climbers. No, in my opinion, it seemed that Sandy Hill simply wasn't liked. And the man who didn't like her had a very powerful pen.
One of the most pervasive claims against Sandy is that she wasn't a real climber, had minimal climbing experience, and didn't belong on Everest. Sandy's passion for mountaineering started long before Everest. She began her outdoors journey in her teens. She actually began climbing at 9 years of age, and her outdoor journey continued. She took up climbing, cross-country skiing, backpacking, and kayaking. She had an earthy, outdoorsy upbringing and was camping in the woods as a child, setting up makeshift tents and cooking over an open fire.
I've been climbing since I was 9 years old. I grew up as a climber kid, like a dirt bag, which is a term of endearment in the climbing world.
Yeah, you were not like an unprepared socialite,
No.
like deciding to.
No,
Yeah.
he portrayed me that way. But in fact, I've been climbing since I was 9 years old.
After moving to New York, she had about a good decade where she didn't do many adventures at all. But then she started feeling stifled in the big city, in the world of businesses and a high-pressure job, so she turned back to the mountains. And it came back with a renewed passion. A trip trekking through the Himalayas reignited her passion for nature. This showed that she wasn't just chasing some high society adventure, she was searching for meaning and purpose. Few people seem to know that by the time of the 1996 Everest disaster, Sandy had already climbed 6 of the 7 summits, and that's the highest mountains on each continent. In fact, after summiting Everest, she became only the second American woman to complete all 7 summits. This wasn't just a casual hobby for her. Climbing the 7 summits was her life's goal, and one that she worked hard on to achieve before she turned 40. At the time, only a handful of women had attempted this feat, let alone complete it, and Sandy was seen by some as a true pioneer for women in mountaineering. Her climbing journey didn't start with Everest. She began with Aconcagua in 1992, deliberately testing herself on one of the more difficult peaks. That same year, she summited Denali in Alaska, one of the most challenging climbs in North America. In 1996, she completed 6 of the 7 summits and only had Everest left. Sandy was the 42nd person and the 6th woman to complete the 7 summits by 1996. So to say she didn't belong on Everest is not only false, but deeply dismissive of her accomplishments. And she had 2 prior attempts on Everest before 96. In 1993, she reached 23,500 feet on the South Col route, and in 1994, she joined an elite team of climbers, including David Brashears and Alex Lowe, on the notoriously difficult Kang Shung face, and that climb was stopped due to avalanche threats. But Krakauer's portrayal of this climb is a prime example of how he downplays her legitimate climbing achievements. The climb was stopped due to an objective danger, not a failure of skill. However, he diminishes her achievement by quoting another climber on the team who said that he and others did all the leading and fixing of ropes, but Sandy contributed to the effort by having a positive attitude, raising money, and dealing with the media. Well, surprise, surprise, climbers paying $65,000 aren't the ones out there leading or fixing ropes. That's why they hire guides and Sherpas. Krakauer didn't lead or fix ropes either, even when it was desperately needed later on during the tragedy. This is another double standard of his. Despite not stepping up to help in numerous ways when it was needed, he still cast judgment on others. He admits in his own words that the credentials of many who came to climb the mountain in 1996 were as thin as mine or thinner, and that at base camp, half the population were clinically delusional about their abilities. He even says in a dispatch with Outside that he had much less altitude experience than probably anyone else here. Yet, despite being one of the least experienced climbers by his own admission, he downplayed his own lack of experience, acting like his purpose as a journalist justifies his presence, while Sandy, despite having way more experience on Everest and high altitude, is treated as though she doesn't belong there. The real issue wasn't Sandy's abilities, it was the narrative Krakauer chose to push. And another comment that you see everywhere on every video about her, in every comment section, is that Sandy didn't thank anyone. But this accusation completely crumbles when you look at the facts. On May 14, 1996, just days after reaching the summit, Sandy gave a radio report via interactive media, where she explicitly thanked guide Neil Beidelman for leading her and two other climbers to safety during the blinding whiteout. She even said, and I quote, "Neil saved my life." In another article, shortly after the disaster, she recounted how she had wandered around in a whiteout until she found Tim Madsen and Charlotte Fox, who were later found by Beidelman. She says he then provided them with life-saving oxygen and led them down the mountain. 10 years later, in 2006, in an article from Outside, Sandy again thanked two men for saving her life. This time, she credited Tim Madsen and Anatoly Bukrev. She said, "I credit two people with saving my life. Tim Madsen for being there after everyone had made the dash back to camp and forcing me to stay positive and alert until Anatoly finally found us. And then, of course, Anatoly, who was in real life the kind of person that superheroes in the movies pretend to be. I remember his big hands reaching down to take mine and how he kept my wobbly legs stable until I got back to the safety of the tent." In the Harvest series video from just last year, she again raves about Anatoly.
Anatoly Bukrev, who is now passed, an incredible, like one of the great climbers of all time and my lifetime hero, came out into the night to find us. And he did, and he brought us back to the safety of the tents.
One thing everyone seems to forget about is how the trauma affected them and their behavior after the disaster. Everyone on the mountain was affected, and they likely still are. Sandy herself reflected on the trauma and grief in her Vogue article, writing, "This catastrophe will haunt her forever, just as it would the others who summited that day." And one quote that has been repeated endlessly, without anybody really questioning it, is when Sandy was asked about her lack of appreciation towards the man who saved her, and she reportedly responded tersely, "Which two gentlemen is that?" And here's the issue with that quote. It's been parroted repeatedly so much that people just take it as gospel. And why is it given so much weight? Well, because it's juicy, and that really gets people riled up. I question about whether that quote was taken out of context or potentially exaggerated, or if it even happened at all. It's also telling that Sandy wasn't particularly cooperative with Vanity Fair. She declined a formal interview, she refused to have her picture taken, and was aloof with the writer, according to the writer herself. So this strained dynamic between them might explain why the article was so skewed against her. The narrative that she was ungrateful and didn't thank anyone just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. She expressed thanks multiple times, even right after the event and as recently as last year. In the end, even her harshest critic, the Vanity Fair writer, conceded that Sandy is far from callous, and her grief for Scott Fischer and the others is obviously quite real. One of the more blatant sexist parts of Krakauer's book is talking about Sandy's love life on Everest. Sandy got married to Bob Pittman in 1979, but by 1995, things were unraveling. According to her website, Bob asked for a divorce 7 months before the Everest trip. Vanity Fair also reported that Bob moved out in October of 1995. And the divorce was finalized in 1997 with Bob remarrying that same year. If we are to rely on the Vanity Fair article at all, a friend did say in that article that in October of 95, the Pittmans had a big party with 50 guests, and she said it was a shock to see that they had split up just a few weeks later. Multiple sources confirmed that Sandy and Bob had separated well before Everest. Sandy met extreme snowboarder Stephen Koch months before Everest. He called her up to ask her about logistical information about the 7 summits because he had a goal of climbing and snowboarding down all of them. And by 1996, Everest was last on his list. Sandy and Stephen reconnected at Everest Base Camp and then began a romantic relationship that lasted well beyond the climbing season. They lived together for a year and a half and also traveled together. In a 2003 Outside article, Sandy says Stephen offered her tremendous support after the tragedy, and he knew much of what was written afterward was exaggerated and fabricated to sell books, magazines, and movies. Stephen himself said that the criticism was unfair and disproportionate, as if she invented the idea of guided climbing. But of course, Krakauer seized the opportunity to mention Sandy's romantic involvement with Stephen, and he also noted that he was much younger than her. He made the claims without naming her, even though everyone knew who he was talking about. He said one of the women on the team angered the goddess of the sky and implied that that was the cause of the disastrous storm. I don't think you can get any more sexist by blaming only the woman here. Stephen, an equal part in this relationship, was left out of the discussion completely.
He even went so far out on a limb as to suggest that the storm was brought on by the wrath of the mountain gods, who were vengeful over my love life. And so, I mean, that just requires so many moving parts to wrap your head around. But so he placed the blame on my shoulders for the storm, for excess at base camp, and there were many other examples.
This kind of one-sided scrutiny paints women as the sole bearers in blame in situations where men and women are equally involved, reinforcing these stupid, outdated gender stereotypes. It creates a narrative where women are punished or shamed for behavior that men are allowed to engage in without consequence. Another blatant lie is that Sandy didn't care about Scott Fischer or her team after the disaster, and this accusation couldn't be further from the truth. Sandy's connection to Scott went far beyond the events of 1996. 10 years after the tragedy, she returned to Everest to put up a memorial for Scott. But her care for Scott's legacy didn't end there. In 2015, Sandy learned that Scott's children had never had the chance to visit their father's memorial. She didn't hesitate to pay for Scott's son to join his sister, who was already in Nepal, to go see the memorial. Scott's son expressed gratitude, saying of Sandy that she was pretty flabbergasted we'd never seen our dad's memorial. Without her help, he wouldn't have been able to afford the trip. Sandy said, Scott's death brought me a connection with his father and his daughter, for which I will always be grateful. Beyond Scott, Sandy has maintained contact with many of the Sherpas and their families over the years. She also kept in contact with Anatoly until his death in 1997. These actions stand in stark contrast to the unfounded rumors that paint her as cold and indifferent. One of the biggest criticisms about Sandy is that she was short-roped or dragged up and down the mountain. First of all, no one can be physically dragged up or down Mount Everest. It's just not possible. There's a 40-foot vertical section, known as the Hillary Step, that no one is getting dragged up or down. The story that has been corroborated by a few people is that Lobsang, the lead Sherpa for Scott's team, tied himself to Sandy and short-roped her as they left Camp 4. And if you're wondering what short roping is, it's defined as a technique where a guide and a client are just basically roped together with a short distance between them while they go over hazardous terrain, and it's for the protection or comfort of the client. It's really used by guides to manage the safety of their clients. Some say Lobsang short roped Sandy for 5 to 6 hours. Both Sandy and Lobsang, however, say it was only about an hour. Either way, short roping on Everest, especially on the ascent, is widely recognized as a bad practice. According to Mark Horrell, a climber and writer, short roping is usually used on the descent to safely bring down a climber who's exhausted. While the climber may lack the coordination, they do need to have sufficient energy to walk, and it's not possible to drag them down like a corpse. He says short roping climbers up a mountain is not unknown, but it's generally frowned upon and rarely successful, as it's exhausting for the climber and guide, and it's extremely dangerous at high altitude. As a guide, it was incredibly reckless for Lopsang to short rope anyone up the mountain. He later said that he thought he was short roping Lena Gammelgaard, another client, but that doesn't make any sense because she was one of the stronger climbers on the team. But Lopsang also changed his story a few times. But what we do know is that Lopsang was likely sick already because he was already exhausted by the time they got to Camp 4. Short roping anyone when he was not feeling well like that was not only bad judgment, but it was super dangerous. Then again, Lopsang was only 23 years old and not a really experienced guide, which may explain why he made that decision. I dove into this detail in my 3-part Everest series, but I will say here that Sandy's critics say that this short roping tired Lopsang out, and he was unable to do the job that he was supposed to do, and that was fixing ropes higher up on the mountain. And in turn, that caused delays, which then people say caused the deaths. But in reality, the climbers and guides didn't need Lopsang. They were perfectly capable of fixing ropes themselves. But they put out this narrative that everybody was waiting and sitting for this one guy who only knew how to set ropes in this section. Well, that's just not true. There were other Sherpas and guides who were getting paid to do that work. And this is where I'll direct you to Michael Tracy's channel. He's been analyzing photos from that day and believes that the photos from that day show that Sandy was not short roped at all. So there's a new theory out there. You can go and watch that and decide for yourself. And one of my favorite climbers that year was Lou Kosciuszki, the lawyer on Rob Hall's team. I think because he was just so honest and forthcoming about what happened up there. And he wrote it all down right after he got back from Everest, but didn't publish it for years and years and years. There's just something really believable and brutally honest about his story. Lou said that each climber is ultimately responsible for their own survival. He acknowledges that while guides are present to assist, every individual is tasked with making decisions that prioritize their own safety. This includes knowing where to turn back or conserve energy for the descent.
Once you're above the death zone on Everest, what they call the death zone, which is above 26,000 feet, you're really on your own. It's a matter of self-reliance. No one can assist you. You either make it down or you're dote on your own. And rarely in history has the forces of nature been the problem. It's always been climber error, making individual decision-making at that point.
And his perspective just highlights the absurdity of blaming one person for the overall failure of the whole expedition by blaming Sandy for every decision that every other climber made is just beyond ridiculous. And we're going to wrap this up with my favorite rumor of all, and that is the most ridiculous one, the infamous cappuccino machine. For decades, Sandy's been vilified for supposedly bringing this gigantic espresso machine and her favorite coffee, how dare she, up Mount Everest. I'm starting to get riled up here. I've been working on this story for a long time, and the more I found out, the more angry I get. But anyways, in the 2023 Harvest series, Sandy laughed at the absurdity of that whole espresso machine debacle, and I'll let her just tell the story.
I did bring a coffee pot, and it was the kind that you probably use, or almost anybody uses on a camping trip, which is those little aluminum mocha machines. Me being me, tried to elevate our coffee experience. So this is my recipe for cappuccino at base camp. You take a mason jar, or your lidded coffee coffee thermos or anything, and you put the coffee in, and then you take powdered milk, and after you've combined the two, then you shake it really hard. And so it's got foam, and then you pour it into another cup, and you say in a very elevated tone to somebody, "Good morning, would you like your cappuccino?"
Okay.
So it looks like that.
Okay.
But rather than finding out the truth of it, it made a better, because you didn't interview me, so it made a better story to talk about my cappuccino machine instead of finding out what really happened.
Sandy pointed out that coffee is always a big deal with climbers, And at the time, fancy coffee was kind of new. And she says, because I'm me, I tried to elevate the team's coffee experience. And you know what? I really get where she's coming from on this, because I have a friend who just has to bring the best of everything no matter where we go. It's kind of like an art. I would bring like raw hot dogs to eat, and she would bring beautiful gourmet foods. We could be going on a tour of Yukon outhouses and she'd still roll up with cheeses from France and smoked salmon flown in from Alaska and a fresh baguette that's somehow still warm. Because why not? It's just the kind of person she is. She just brings luxury items everywhere you go. Even if you're just sitting on a log in the woods, you have this beautiful spread to eat from. It is kind of like just that little comfort of home. And that seems to be the personality type of Sandy Hill. She likes to have those comforts of home. And Beck Weathers said in Antarctica he quite enjoyed all those comforts because she shared them willingly. Let's get back to the cappuccino machine. And that idea of the giant cappuccino machine, well, that just makes for a way better story than a tiny regular little camping coffee pot. But it was completely fabricated. Sandy also brought satellite phones, laptops, video equipment, and other gear to file her dispatches back to NBC. And she's been criticized for this because all this equipment was carried by Sherpas, as everything was on Everest. And she also paid to have extra Sherpas to haul all this gear. And let's be clear on this, Scott Fischer, the leader of the team, allowed it. Scott had a vested interest in Sandy making those media dispatches. He even took part in hour-long chats here and there and with Sir Edmund Hillary, showcasing how important the media attention was to his expedition. In fact, just as the other team had Krakauer filing dispatches, Scott's team had Sandy serving as a journalist, documenting the journey for the world to follow, just like Krakauer did for Rob Hall. And Sandy's reports were for the public, but they were also for classrooms. There was classrooms all over the US who were tracking every update. And today we would call this media savvy. The innovation she brought to Everest that year was pretty much ahead of its time, and the narrative spun it to be a thing of excess. And this is a reminder how easily the truth can be manipulated to give a good story. Sandy wasn't just a socialite with fancy gadgets. She was a climber who, like many others, were pioneering new ways to experience and document the most extreme places on Earth. So those are the 7 rumors and lies. And there is more out there, but I had to cut this somewhere. If you want to see a part 2, let me know. I've already done 2 parts on her. I could do a part 3. Not anytime soon, because I needed a break from Everest and mountaineering, but let me know what you think. And I'll leave it at this. Sandy's story is an example of how easily the truth can be twisted when a convenient scapegoat is needed, especially when gender and wealth are at play. She wasn't the cause of the 1996 Everest disaster, nor was she the helpless, spoiled socialite the media portrayed her to be. She was a skilled climber, a trailblazer who achieved the 7 summits, and someone who deeply cared about the people and the legacy left behind on the mountain. The criticism she faced, much of it rooted in sexism, highlights how women in traditional male spaces are often judged far more harshly than the males. While other climbers' mistakes were overlooked or ignored or forgiven, Sandy was subjected to relentless blame, mockery, and vilification. The 1996 Everest tragedy was a collective failure, a tragic series of events for which no single person can be blamed. This story is also a powerful reminder of how easily narratives can be twisted, especially when they target someone who doesn't fit into those traditional molds. The way she was scapegoated shows how quickly we judge based on stereotypes, whether it's assuming someone's incompetence because of their wealth, or assuming a woman can't handle a chainsaw, or climb a mountain. And no, we're still not related, but after all this research, I really feel like we could be at least long-lost cousins.